All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to U.S. Multicultural Literatures. Today we are turning to a different unit, or I don't like unit, that sounds sort of high schoolish. Let's say a chapter, that sounds literary. A different chapter in the class, where we will be turning to perhaps the most controversial of the isms we're looking at throughout this course, which is postmodernism. So let me just repeat what I said early in the semester, which is I've organized this class according to the isms, these kinds of broad movements in literary and cultural history that we've seen throughout the last 100 years. But I think I did warn you that these isms are only ever approximations when you're talking about individual works of art and literature. No individual work perfectly correlates with any broad movement. These movements are named to try to capture broad tendencies. But the point of literature, the point of art, is to be very singular, to be very individual, to surprise us. As I think I mentioned early in the class, I don't think any interesting work of literature is ever simply in one genre but occupies multiple genres. I think that same goes for these broader movements. I don't think these are genres, which are sort of ways of organizing works that have long traditions, but these are kind of movements, these isms. The reason there are so many isms is precisely because of what we were talking about at the very beginning of the class, that with the collapse in certain received narratives that told us what history and culture were supposed to be, and with the relativizing of culture to cultures that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century, it was no longer clear how, artists and writers were to go about their business. So they all had to kind of write manifestos and come up with movements that told them how to do so in the absence of a generally agreed upon social ground and social mission of art. So hence you get modernism's rupture with tradition, and hence you get postmodernism's even deeper rupture with tradition, including some of the traditions it inherits from the early 20th century modernists. In postmodernism, though, more than any other ism, is a word that is thrown around and has been for about 40 years, not even to discuss art, but to talk about general social movements, political movements, the character of our society. We live in postmodern times, people say. Some people are quite. Postmodernism is very controversial. Some people say it doesn't really exist. It was a trend in the 80s and it's over now. Some people say it's ruined our society. It's fiercely criticized on both the political left and the political right for having corrupted politics for reasons I think I'll be able to explain shortly. So it's a very controversial word and seems to apply to more than just the arts. And it seems to be a descriptor not only for art and literature in a certain period, roughly the late 20th century, but also for the general condition of society in that period. So, what is postmodernism? It's going to take me a little while to explain. I'll probably spend more of this lecture on the theoretical stuff, and then I'll get to the poetry I'd like to look at later. And I'll probably have to carry over the discussion of the poetry until the next lecture. That'll cut in a little bit to our first lecture on Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter, but that's a very short book. That's a shorter book, I think, than the others we've read. So I think that's okay. So here we go. Let me just start. The first thing I want to do, though, just think about what I said about modernist architecture in the first lecture on mid-century culture. I said the characteristics of modernist architecture was this square white building with a lot of glass and steel and kind of exposed concrete. It was very rectilinear. It was very square. It tried to sort of get to the fundamentals, the fundamental shape of architecture, and lay bare those fundamentals, just as modernism in literature tries, if you think of quicksand, is a very psychological, very inward form of writing fiction. It tries to lay bare the workings of the psyches of the characters. So modernist architects try to lay bare the underlying structures of buildings. Modernist poets like Gertrude Stein try to lay bare the workings of language. Okay, so modernism holds on to this idea that even though we've ruptured with tradition, even though we've broken with tradition, there's something under it that's real that we're going to show you. Now look at a key work of postmodernist architecture, which I've pictured on my slide. Some of you, if you've been on the University of Minnesota campus, will recognize this building. This is the Weisman Art Museum, which is just at the end of the Washington Avenue Bridge as you head toward the West Bank, okay? So if you've been on campus, you've seen this building. This is a building designed by Frank Gehry, Gehry, one of the foremost postmodernist architects in America. He designed this building in 1993. And you can immediately see some differences from modernist architecture. This isn't square. The shapes are going all over the place. There's a kind of playfulness to where I don't think there's even a square in the building. There's rounded corners. There's what are shapes that aren't square? There's like rhombus-like shapes, whatever that means. There's that weird, if you look over to the far left, there's that weird thing kind of jutting out that's curved. The building looks like a kind of tin can that's been recycled or something. And what is the front of it? The front of it looks like kind of aluminum foil. It's not the clear reflective glass of the surface of the modernist white square building, but it's this kind of blurry reflective foil shape. This is playful. It's not clearly defined in its geometry. Postmodernism is all over the place. That's the idea of postmodernism. But why? What does it mean? I mentioned, and we're going to look at some more examples of postmodern visual art in a minute, and we're going to look at some postmodern poetry shortly. But what does it mean? I said that many people think that postmodernism is not just a school of art that starts in the 50s and extends to the end of the 20th century, though it is that. It's a school of painting, of architecture, of poetry, of fiction, as we'll see. But it's also a general condition of our society, that we have entered what theorists have called the postmodern condition. So it's not just our art that's postmodern, it's our politics, it's our science, it's our way of organizing our societies in general. It's, in fact, our technology. So let's look at some people who have theorized postmodernism. I'm going to give you two theories of what postmodernism is, and then we'll see how that manifests itself in the arts, and also what that has to do with multiculturalism. We have to talk about what that has to do with this idea that we've been tracking of different definitions of culture. So I think one of the first main attempts to define what postmodernism was came from a French philosopher named Jean-François Lyotard in the 1970s. And he wrote a very short, really just an essay-length book called The Postmodern Condition. And what he says in this book, he defines postmodernism actually very simply. He defines it as a suspicion of grand narratives. And what he says is this. He says modern politics and art made big claims for themselves. So think back to, I already sort of said this, but think back to what I said about modernism in the arts. We had modernist architecture trying to lay bare the basic structure of architecture. We had modernist poetry trying to lay bare the basic structure of language. We have modernist fiction trying to lay bare the basic structure of human psychology. Modern art, as much as it broke with tradition, still made the promise that it was going to tell you a kind of truth that had never been told before. Think even of Langston Hughes's poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. That gives you a grand narrative of civilizations outside Europe and their sort of great story as they progress toward liberation. All right. So modern art offers a grand narrative of truth. It will tell you the truth about something, about the structure of art, the structure of the human mind, the emancipatory story of individual sort of cultural groups, ethnic groups, racial groups. There's going to be a grand narrative. Think also of the martyred. What was the kind of question of the martyred? The question was whether history has a shape. Well, think about Marxism. Marxism, which is a quintessential modern ideology, tells us that the history of human society has been the history of struggles between oppressor classes and oppressed classes, and eventually this struggle will end when the oppressed class of the modern world, which is the industrial working class, overthrows the ruling class and institutes finally an equal culture. All of history in this sense is moving toward a conclusion. This is a grand narrative about how history works. Modern politics and modern art made big promises about telling big stories that would give you truths that had not been available before the modern, that would liberate humanity. However, as I think the martyred and some of the poetry we read, such as Anthony Hecht's More Light, made clear, these promises were not kept. What actually happened was catastrophe. You had the Holocaust, you had communist totalitarianism, you had a general sense of the progress of modern technology creating environmental degradation, the progress of modern politics in the United States, for instance. We talked about the, after World War II, you had the GI Bill, you had the expansion of the middle class, you had the growth of suburbanization, and yet who was left out of that? You had general exclusions, particularly of African Americans, left out of that big narrative of progress. You had what accompanied, for instance, suburbanization was a reinstitution of the nuclear family, and many, women felt left out of that story because they considered that a kind of relegation to second-class citizenship status. So all of this progress, all of these promises of truth, revealed that they couldn't keep up. They couldn't give what they said they would give. In that case, says Lyotard, the postmodern condition is one in which we've realized that big claims about truth and big stories about progress always leave somebody out and often produce catastrophe rather than liberation or rather than truth. And so we should be skeptical of all universal claims to truth, because all universal claims to truth leave somebody out, and instead we should focus on the diversity and plurality of cultures and people. And you might say, well, wasn't that happening in the modernist era? I would say, yeah, there were hints of that happening in the modernist era that uneasily coexisted beside big claims about truth. And I hope I demonstrated that. And I would ask you to think back to Alan Locke's manifesto of the New Negro, where we saw him hesitating between different options for what African American emancipation would look like. And one of those options, I think, was quintessentially modern, that African Americans would be the kind of leaders of a morally renewed American nation that finally kept its promises to every one of its citizens. That's a grand narrative. Another of his claims was that African Americans might be considered sort of culturally separatist, might separate themselves off from broader American society and from other groups within American society, and sort of conduct their own culture within that group. That, to me, is a postmodern claim. So back in the era I called modernist, we have a figure like Alan Locke struggling between these two ideas. And that's what I want to tell you about isms. They never perfectly capture any one work, any one thinker. There's always kind of tensions. But the postmodern condition is one in which we emphasize the skepticism of universal truth claims and focus instead on the diversity and plurality of cultures and people. And as a corollary, we should understand that all truth claims are narratives, are stories, or are what Lyotard calls language games. They're social constructs, they're made up of language. They don't really reflect the truth because it's not within human power for anyone to tell the truth with a capital T. That's Lyotard's theory. Now, another influential, I almost said controversial, but that's true too, controversial thinker who defined postmodernism was Frederick Jameson. He is a Marxist thinker. We've talked about Marxism before. I talked about it in the last slide. And he is much more skeptical about postmodernism, or much more skeptical that it's a good thing. For Lyotard, it's basically a good thing, and it's an ethical mission. You need to be skeptical of universal truth claims because they have been used to abuse and to exclude people. There's an ethical imperative to be skeptical anytime anybody says they're claiming to tell the truth. That's Lyotard's position. Jameson says, well, okay, but so he is a Marxist, which means that he believes in one of these grand narratives. He believes in a universal story of human emancipation that is backed up by the history of class struggle, and that class struggle will eventually end, at least he hopes, with the institution of a utopian, classless, egalitarian society. So he looks at postmodernism and says, actually, it's not this great ethical thing that Lyotard wants to claim it is. It's actually just the conditions of what he calls a late capitalist consumer society. He says that postmodernism is what happens to a society when it undergoes certain economic changes that happened in the United States and Europe and Japan and other, what used to be called first world countries. What happened there was the economy shifted from one focused on production to one focused on consumption. It used to be that, a lot of the goods that you would be, purchase in America if you were a consumer were produced in America. But what happens with the deregulation of capitalism in the late 20th century is companies now have the ability to take their production overseas where they're not bound by certain labor laws, where they can pay lower wages, where they aren't bound even by certain, safety standards in their factories, and they can offshore their production. So now we live in a society where it's basically based entirely on consumption rather than on production. And we also live in a society that is international in its capitalism rather than national, because all our big companies have these massive overseas holdings and production capabilities. So once you move to a consumer society under international capitalism, and Jameson calls this late because he's a Marxist, so he thinks this is, one of the last things that's going to happen before the revolution. I don't mean to say that mockingly, but I don't think that's going to happen. But my views are immaterial. Once that happens, once you move to a consumer society, then everything looks like it's equal to everything else because everything is equally consumable. So all values, all forms of art, all cultural practices, all exist on the same plane. It's as if you went into, when Jameson was writing, it was the 80s. So you'd go into a mall and you'd see all cultural values are equally on sale. Now you don't even go to the mall because technological shifts have made it so that you go online, and all cultural values, all forms of art, all practices, they're all equally for sale on Amazon. And so what that means is, we have the consumer freedom to choose, but what that does is it levels everything, not just to a kind of relativism, but it makes everything kind of a commodity for sale. And so all values and boundaries are suspended. And keep in mind, Jameson has an ethical imperative too, just as Lyotard does. Jameson says, this is happening in our society, but it's because we still live in an extremely economically exploitative paradigm. It's just that the people being exploited aren't visible to us. They're overseas. They're being exploited overseas for the consumer goods that make everything seem free and equal to us. This freedom and equality, this pluralism that Lyotard praised, comes at the expense of a still unequal and exploitative society. But anyway, Jameson says once consumer society suspends all traditional hierarchies and values on the relativizing plane of free choice, that means that all modern ideas sort of go away. History is no longer a narrative because everything is appearing to us simultaneously. The self is no longer a coherent subject about which a novelist like Nella Larson could tell the truth, but it's now just made up of all of these different consumer choices that it purchases. And art, because art is now, any individual work of art is now on the same plane with every other individual work of art. Art can no longer be sort of meaningfully true. Art is also kind of relativized. And we'll see that one of the implications of postmodernism is you can no longer really say that one form of art or one work of art is better than another. So we're just left as de-centered selves that are the we are just kind of the collection of our consumer choices suspended in an ahistorical eternal present, making art that is only a superficial art of surfaces. And again, just go back and look. We could see that applying to Frank Gehry's design for the Weisman Art Museum. There's no truth of architecture being displayed here. There is just a play with the surfaces of materials. And we can see it in other forms of art as well. I just want to run down a list of characteristics of postmodernism as it appears in works of art. Then I want to turn to another visual example, and then I want to turn to an example for poetry, and I want to discuss this idea's relation to multiculturalism. So I think there are 5 basic characteristics of postmodern art. The first is pastiche. This is a word that you can see, it's a French word, but you can see like English, words in it like paste. It's a word for a kind of collage that borrows words, images, tropes, or modes of art and combines them in one work of art. So postmodern work often takes incongruous elements from different areas of culture and language and throws them together. And so you have a work that is radically kind of internally incongruous. We're going to see that I want to read Frank OHara's poem, The Day Lady Died, as an example of postmodern poetry. And you'll see that he takes words and images from very different domains of culture and puts them in the same poem. So this pastiche is a key quality of postmodernist art. Related to that is a combination of high and low culture. So we have to go back to what we talked about with culture at the beginning of the class. One definition of culture was Matthew Arnold's "the best that has been thought and said," that the citizen of the nation should study the best works of art, which would be high culture, classic works of literature, classic works of painting and sculpture and orchestral music and serious philosophy. That was the best that had been thought and said. And other forms of culture were low. Popular music, mass media, mass literature, let's say in the mid-20th century, movies, radio, forms of music like jazz or rock, forms of media like comic books or paperback popular fiction, that was low. Postmodernism says, well, if there's no longer any grand narrative to tell us the truth about society with a capital T, then there's no longer any way to determine that one form of culture is the best that has been thought and said, and another form of culture is low, is trash, is crap, we don't need to attend to it. The high-low culture distinction just goes out the window. So, in postmodern works of art, such as O'Hara's The Day Lady Died and the painting by Andy Warhol I'm about to show you, you have a combination of cultural elements once seen as divided into high culture, myth, religion, literature, classical music, serious painting, and low culture, movies, pop music, comics, etc. So, a pastiche of disparate elements in one work and a combination of high and low culture because the distinction between high and low culture has eroded. Another thing you see, and this is particularly true in fiction, and this is what our novel of the postmodern moment, Philip Roth's The Ghostwriter, is going to be all about, is meta fiction. Meta fiction is when you constantly remind readers that the text is a work of fiction. And what does that have to do with postmodernism? Back to Lyotard. All truth claims are to be scrutinized. We're to be skeptical of all narratives. So now postmodern narratives tell us, hey, I'm just a narrative. Be skeptical of me. I'm going to remind you that you're just reading a story. And you need to be skeptical of the story I'm telling you, because you need to be skeptical of all stories. So this meta-fictional element comes into play. And there's also forms of meta poetry, meta painting, etc. All of this leads to what I would call a radical form of irony. So traditionally in literature, irony is a reversal of meaning or expectation. So two classic forms of irony in literature are verbal irony, where you say one thing and you mean another. It's a kind of understatement. So we saw that a lot in The Martyred, where the whole tone of the book was very understated and what that had the effect of doing, ironically, was communicating just how painful and passionate and emotional the experiences being described were. I think that's a form of verbal irony. Another form of verbal irony just in everyday life is sarcasm, where you say something and you mean the opposite. Sure, I'm happy to see you, but you're not happy to see that person. But that relies on a stable sense of the truth. When you say to someone, sure, I'm happy to see you, for that to work as sarcasm, the other person has to know you're not happy to see them. For Richard E. Kim's technique of understatement to work, we have to know that the understated tone is concealing the truth of the volcanic emotions underneath it. Similarly, another form of irony in literature is situational irony, when what we expect to happen doesn't happen, when our expectations are frustrated. And so let's look at quicksand. We would expect a brilliantly intelligent and accomplished and culturally cultivated person like Helga Crane to find success in life, and yet she's defeated in her life. And so that's a situational irony. But that too, Nella Larson is depending on us to realize that that's wrong, that Helga Crane shouldn't be defeated, and that the reason she's been defeated is because of the racism and sexism she's been subjected to. So that reversal of expectation depends on a stable sense of what should happen for us to feel it as ironic. So both these forms of irony depend on you knowing what the truth is. Postmodern irony, by contrast, leaves us with a sense that there is no truth. There's no stable position from which to judge the narrative or to judge any verbal statement, because somehow every element of the work is so relativistic that you can't tell what the author thinks of anything. So with traditional irony, we're given the opposite of truth, which is used to evoke the truth. Sure, I'm happy to see you, but we know you're not happy. And for it to work as irony, we have to know you're not happy. Postmodern irony is, it's more like when somebody says something and you don't know if they're kidding. You don't know if they mean it. I don't know if you know anybody like this, but there's a certain type of person that sort of says everything with a little kind of smirk, and you can never quite tell if it's true or not. That's postmodern irony. I think we're going to see that in the work of visual art I'm going to show you in a moment. The final characteristic of postmodernism, this one was named in particular by Frederick Jameson, is the waning of affect. Affect means emotion. So, as you can tell, if the work of art is pastiched together out of disparate elements, and if it's constantly reminding you that it is a work of art, and if it leaves you no position from which to say what the author's point of view is, then it's going to be hard to create emotion in a work of art with those characteristics. So the waning of affect is that artistic styles become cool, detached, cynical, and devoid of strong feeling. And I say cynical because if you can't locate what the artist thinks about anything, then there's a kind of cynical rejection of all values. That's a darker way of reading Lyotard's Suspicion of Grand Narratives. It's just a cynical, you shrug and you say, whatever, everything sucks, who cares? There's a kind of cynicism to that quality of postmodern art. So everything becomes flat, detached, and devoid of strong feeling. So let's look at how this plays out in visual art. Again, I think that's often clearer than literature. So we looked at Picasso's La Demoiselle d'Avignon from 1907 as our key example of modernist art. So I'm going to look at another visual image by an influential painter of the postmodern era, my fellow Pittsburgher Andy Warhol, and his screen print Marilyn Monroe from 1967. So 60 years later, we see what's happened. And Picasso is probably the most important, influential visual artist of the modernist era in painting. I would say Warhol is probably the equivalent in postmodernism. So let's compare these two and contrast these two paintings. So they're both paintings of women, and they're both paintings of women in a sexualized context. So the women in Picasso's painting are sex workers in a brothel. The woman in Warhol's painting is a celebrity who was considered a sex symbol in the mid-20th century. So that's the thing they have in common. I would say everything else is different. So first of all, I'm too casually using the word painting. Picasso's work is a painting. He stretched a canvas and painted on the canvas. Warhol's work is not a painting, it's a screen print based on a photograph. So he took a photograph and he used a printing process that's used for the mass production of images to add color to it. So painting is a form of art that stresses the individuality of the painter. Warhol takes a photograph and then puts it through a mass production process, as if to say, hey, I have nothing to do with this. All he did was add the colors in the screen print process. So we have a painting stressing the individuality of the artist's genius in Picasso's case, and we have Warhol sort of stepping back and saying, hey, I didn't do anything here. I'm just participating in our general social mass production of images. So that's one difference. Another difference is in Picasso's, we have multiple perspectives incorporated, as I talked about at the beginning of the semester. We have the women's sort of faces seen in sort of head-on and in profile at the same time. But Picasso is doing this to stress the individuality or the multiplicity of any individual perspective. He's walking into this room and he's seeing it from different angles, and he's giving it to you from all the different angles from which he sees it, to try to create a kind of kinetic multiple viewpoint of his own. But in any case, the view is his. The multiple perspectives are all coming from one subjectivity, from one psychology. In Warhol's case, there is no view. The view is mass societies. He took a photograph from a newspaper or a magazine, and he ran it through the screen printing process. This isn't his point of view on Marilyn Monroe, because he didn't take the picture. His view is simply mass society's view. We all have the same view, which is that of the mass production of images. And so society is made up of nothing other than mass-produced images. There is no individual point of view. And that goes back to that idea that the postmodern self isn't really a self. It's just a collection of languages, discourses, images that circulate in a consumer society. Let's talk about the sort. Well, I already covered the next one. Sorry, I'm reading from an index card if you can't tell. So in Picasso's view, he's created a highly individual form of painting. He's given you, out of the genius of his painterly labor, a new way of seeing, which is the multiplicity of views that accompany any individual's perspective. So even though it seems multiple because you have multiple perspectives on the same figures, it all redounds to the genius of the artist. Picasso is still this great genius who has shown you the truth of how we see things. Warhol, there's no originality in Warhol's image, and he makes no claims for originality. He makes no claims to truth. He has, and here I'm repeating myself, he's taken an image out of the circulation of society and just put it back in to circulation. He hasn't given you anything of himself. Now, let's talk about, so again, we talked about sort of sexuality in these two images. In Picasso's image, there's nothing in the painting that tells us that this is taking place in a realm in which sexuality is being transacted. There's no sort of sign in the painting that's saying these are sex workers, this is a brothel. Sexuality here just seems to kind of overwhelm any economic discourses. Warhol does just the opposite. Warhol shows that sexuality in our culture is entirely a media construct. Sexuality is as culturally constructed as anything else. Why? Because the mass circulation of images of beautiful people, and Warhol made images of men as well as women, is controlled by the media. So sexuality itself is nothing but produced by the replication of signs. So there's also a question of this sort of sexuality of the painter implied in each image. Picasso, we know from his biography, this was a place he went to. This was something he saw. The sexuality is the painter's. In Warhol's case, the sexuality is society's, and all he adds, and here it's a little bit complicated, what he adds is these bright colors that aren't there in the original photograph. He exaggerates the kind of brightness of he sort of amps up the sexuality of the image by making the eyeshadow and the lipstick and the blonde hair he turns all that up to 11. Why is he doing that? Is it to make the image more sexual? No, I would argue that it's an ironic commentary on the sexuality of the image. He dials it up. And in this way, it is, there was a school of kind of a subset of postmodernist art called camp, C-A-M-P. And camp was identified particularly as the subcultural style of queer communities in urban America, to which Andy Warhol, as a gay artist, belonged. And what camp did was it took features of mass culture and popular culture and kind of exaggerated them for ironic appreciation. And so I think we can see Warhol, now he, as a gay artist, is not painting or making this print out of his sexual desire for Marilyn Monroe. He didn't feel that desire. What he's doing is ironically exaggerating the broader culture's sexual desire. And so in that case, if we want to apply a feminist critique, we might say that Picasso is sort of giving us this male, heterosexual, desiring gaze that is kind of subjugating the women in the painting, whereas Warhol is making an ironic, we might say somewhat feminist comment on the production of objectifying images of women. He's sort of commenting on how that process happens. So I think that brings me to my final point, which is that Picasso's painting has a kind of seriousness that is on the surface, whereas Warhol gives you a kind of joking surface. But I think Warhol, the seriousness of it is in the critical edge. He's calling into question the grand narrative of heterosexuality in society, whereas Picasso is giving you the lethally serious vision of his own heterosexual gaze. So I hope that seeing these two images side by side and thinking about how they exhibit different qualities of modernist and postmodernist art is helpful to you. I know it's a very abstract discussion. It's hard for me to define postmodernism. It's a hard word to define for as much as it gets thrown around, but I'm trying to give you as best a sense as I can. Now let's look at a literary example. So one of the poems I asked you to read was Frank OHara's poem, The Day Lady Died. So Frank OHara belonged to another kind of subset of poets in the 50s and 60s called the New York School of Poetry. And they were interested in a casual kind of witty poetry that often referenced the visual arts and that was interested in, on the one hand, high culture, like abstract expressionist painting of the kind we saw with Jackson Pollock, but on the other hand, popular culture, such as jazz and kind of urban street culture. And the New York School was associated with poets like Frank OHara and John Ashbery, who, like Warhol, were gay men and who participated in this kind of campy, subcultural, this queer style of camp. Again, CAMP. I'm borrowing here. Again, I think I quoted her a few lectures ago. Susan Sontag, the American cultural critic, she wrote the sort of essay in 1964, Notes on Camp, that defined this style. And this is seen as a major essay also defining kind of postmodern irony, because camp, the exaggerated appreciation of popular culture and other kinds of culture to show kind of the relativity of all culture and appreciation, this is a defining sort of postmodern style. So Frank OHara just briefly lived from 1926 to 1966. He was born in Baltimore, I think to Irish parents, raised in Massachusetts, and served in World War II. He attended Harvard, where he met John Ashbery, the other major New York School poet, and started publishing poetry. And in his most productive years, he lived in New York City with his partner and taught at the New School there, and became active as both a critic and a curator in the art world and a poet. He tragically died quite young, from being just struck by a vehicle. He was hit by a car. So that's why he died at such a young age. But he produced a very influential body of poetry. And this is one of his most influential poems. I'd like to just read it to you and then to comment on some of the features that both make it a postmodern poem, but also, I think, show us the way in which postmodernism doesn't apply to every work of art. So let's just read it. The Day Lady Died. It is 12:20 in New York, a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959, and I go get a shoe shine, because I will get off the 419 in East Hampton at 7:15 and then go straight to dinner, and I don't know the people who will feed me. I walk up the muddy street beginning to sun and have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go on to the bank, and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look up my balance for once in her life. And in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bonnard, although I do think of Hesiod, trans Richard Lattimore, or Brendan Behan's new play, or Le Balcon or Le Negre of Genet. But I don't. I stick with Verlaine, after practically going to sleep with quandriness, and for Mike I just stroll into the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega, and then I go back where I came from to 6th Avenue and the Tobacconist and the Ziegfeld Theater, and casually asked for a carton of Gauloise and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. And I am sweating a lot by now, and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5 spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. So, what is this poem about? So the basic idea is that, and again, you'd have to, this poem needs a footnote to explain it, but if you were reading it when it was first published in the 50s, you'd know. It was about the day that Billie Holiday, who was a famous jazz singer, died. and the poet, the speaker, is going about his day, doing the things he does during his day. He goes, he's living the life of an urban artist. He wakes up, um, he goes to get his shoe shine, he goes book shopping, he's buying some books and some wine for his friends, and then he sees, and this is a very modern experience, you look in the media and you find out that a celebrity has died. And the other modern experience is that that celebrity that you didn't know personally means the world to you, and you legitimately grieve that celebrity. This was not something that happened before mass media. Um, it really wasn't something that could have happened. You need a world of newspapers and television and radio to create celebrities, to give you news of their personal life that makes you feel like you know them. And that is when you grieve, when you find out they've died. So this is a very kind of modern experience, or a postmodern experience, if you will, because it's related to this mass media environment. But look at what the way the poem is structured. This is not the kind of Ezra Pound ideal of cutting all irrelevancies out of the poem to give you a clear image of the truth. That's modernism. Frank OHara gives you everything he did that day, because he is, to quote Lyotard, or to paraphrase Lyotard, he is interested not in giving you a grand narrative of the truth, but just what he's doing. This is meta poetry. This is the poet's life. This is what the poet does. He'll even tell you about his shoe shine. He'll tell you the timetable of the train he's going to get on. He'll tell you what he bought for his friends. And he puts together different things. He says he bought New World Writing. This was a kind of avant-garde poetry journal that showcased world literature. I bought New World Writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. So that right there tells you that the literary world is heavily globalized, even in the 1950s. But he also puts that up against his interest in the Ziegfeld Theater, in buying cigarettes, and in the New York Post, which was and still is, a fairly trashy tabloid paper. So, the periodicals mentioned are this avant-garde literary journal and this trashy periodical. And he also puts together Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet, in the translation of Richmond Lattimore, and very sort of avant-garde drama by Jean Genet, and French poetry by Paul Verlaine, and he puts that together with his interest in Billie Holiday, who was a singer of popular music, a jazz singer. So all of these different cultural elements are put together in this one poem, and none of them are weighed more heavily than any other. It's all on the continuum of the poet's day. So we have that high-low combo, and we have that meta quality, that meta-fictional or meta-poetic quality of the poet telling you what it is to be this poet on this day. So in that way, this is a very quintessentially postmodern poem. However, what I want to suggest is that these characteristics do not fully exhaust any given work of art. And so one postmodern characteristic in this poem that is not present is the waning of affect. Or it is present up until that last stanza. So the poem has a kind of jokey, ironic breathlessness of the poet telling you about the trivialities of his day. And I would say that that's not very emotional. There's a kind of gentle humor to that, like, this guy's just telling us everything he's going to do that day. Like, when's he going to stop? Is he going to tell us when he goes in the bathroom or what? Like, there's a kind of gentle comedy to it. But then that last stanza hits you, and it's meant to hit you as a genuinely emotional moment when he finds out about Billie Holiday's death. And I am sweating a lot by now, and thinking of leaning on the John door in the 5 spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing. Because her art was so profound that it, he's giving you He's giving you a better version of the cliche, she took our breath away. And the poem ends with that breathlessness of grief and awe before her art and before the loss of her art. And in that sense, it's not a postmodern poem because the waning of affect gives way to very strong affect in the end. And that's why I quoted the critic Charles Altieri on this slide. Charles Altieri says of this poem that it exemplifies how postmodern literature can thrive, though oppressed on the one side by philosophical nihilism. So philosophical nihilism is just that belief that there is no truth. We can't philosophically establish any truth. So that's what oppresses the postmodern artist on the one hand, nihilism. We can't believe in anything. And on the other, by the oppressive burden of literary history. So the postmodern poet is burdened by the crushing weight of the past, as signaled by Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet being mentioned in this poem from 1959. But literature can remain honest and demystified without succumbing to self-pitying nostalgia or refining away its content in the self-conscious acrobatics of what John Barth has called the literature of exhaustion. Let's get rid of all the specific references in there and say this. OHara gives you a postmodern poem just as Lyotard would ask for. One that says, there is no grand narrative, there is no grand truth, but he nevertheless still gives you a poem that possesses immense emotional impact by the end. So you can have most of the characteristics of postmodernism in art, but you can still get to something real. And in this poem, it's the emotion. It's the grief, it's the awe, it's the gratitude for Billie Holiday and the sorrow at her death. I would say that holds true in Warhol's painting too, his screen print of Marilyn Monroe. It's not the emotion you get so much, but it's what I mentioned earlier, which is the critique of the commodification and objectification of women in consumer society that is generated by the painting's ironically extreme portrayal of this image. So no work of postmodern art that I can think of, at least I'm being too categorical. Very few works of postmodern art are 100% postmodern, which is to say 100% nihilistic. Most of them will give you some undercurrent of feeling or will make some claim that something is true or right. It's very hard to make a work of art that doesn't do that. So you don't get the pure nihilism of postmodernism that Altieri claims is here in most works of art. And that brings me to the final topic I'd like to cover today before getting to a couple more poems in the next lecture. I want to talk about what the relationship of postmodernism is to multiculturalism. And I think there's three possible relations. I've abbreviated them PM for postmodernism, MC for multiculturalism. I think in one reading, postmodernism and multiculturalism are the same thing. Postmodernism calls all grand narratives and all dominant normative master narratives into question. And so that just naturally leads to multiculturalism. It says that if you can't say that any one culture holds the truth, then you necessarily recognize the plurality of cultures, each in its own full legitimacy. All truth claims should be considered equal. All cultural practices should be considered equal. If cultures were once judged, let's say back in the 19th century or early 20th century, European cultures in the era of imperialism said, well, Europe's culture is superior to non-European cultures for these 5 reasons. Well, postmodernism says no. We've called all of those hierarchical values and grand narratives into question, and so you can't say that any one culture is better than any other. Postmodernism and multiculturalism express the same underlying cultural movement, which is one toward pluralism and relativism. However, there's also an argument you could make that postmodernism is even sort of superior to multiculturalism. Because if we say that we can't say that one culture is better than another, you're still talking about singular cultures. You're still saying, okay, we have, let's say, European cultures here, Asian cultures here, African cultures here. I'm speaking in the broadest possible terms. But you're still saying there's some way you can define these things. And you could define it more narrowly: French culture, Japanese culture, white American culture, African American culture, Jewish American culture, Asian American culture. But if we're speaking in these terms, we're still saying that cultures exist and have a kind of singular kind of essence underlying them that allows us to speak of them as such. But remember, postmodernism calls all claims to truth, narrative, coherence into question. Under postmodernism, any unified culture is just a collection of disparate elements, and so can be, to use a very postmodern word, deconstructed into these disparate elements. Similarly, okay, so European culture says it's superior to these other cultures, and postmodernism calls that into question. But any individual culture, if it is a culture, makes certain claims about the way things should be. Any individual culture makes claims about a narrative it's shared throughout its history and about the way that it should be organized. Again, think of Langston Hughes' The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which gives you this kind of triumphant reclamation of the history of the cultures of the African diaspora. Well, postmodernism might say, well, just as you can't allow European culture to make any special claims for its unity, coherence, or truth, you can't allow the cultures of the African diaspora to make those claims either. Everything gets deconstructed, every bit of it. And insofar as postmodernism, as we'll see, accompanies movements like feminism and gay liberationism, then you might say, well, all cultures have sort of oppressive aspects toward women or towards forms of sexuality it considers non-normative, and they need to be deconstructed too. That ethical claim that Lyotard gives us, that we need to call all the received wisdom of any grand narrative into question, goes across the board. And then finally, though, you could make the counterclaim that multiculturalism is in fact superior to postmodernism. Because when postmodernism questions all master narratives, all claims to truth, and all received values, then it doesn't give you any reason to say that it's wrong to oppress people. And I would say that underlying multiculturalism is an ethical claim of its own, which is that non-European and non-white cultures have been pretty severely oppressed, in the main, just to speak in generalities. And multiculturalism, by bringing these cultures to the fore, is a form of ethical redress for that prior oppression. But if postmodernism calls all values into question, doesn't it call all moral values into question? Doesn't it say, isn't there a contradiction in postmodernism, by the way? If all values are called into question, then where does this ethical imperative to deconstruct all norms and grand narratives come from? If you've called everything into question, you've called everything into question. Nothing matters. Nothing means anything. So in that case, multiculturalism doesn't mean anything either. And it doesn't matter if you were oppressed, because oppression itself is a moral category, and we've called all moral categories into question. So in that case, isn't postmodernism, from the point of view of multiculturalism, dangerous? Doesn't it lead to a political and moral anarchy that fails to challenge oppression, as multiculturalism was meant to do? Now, we can't answer that today. We can't really say today how that's going to play itself out. Different writers we're going to read in this course are going to take different positions, and we just have to see what those are. But I wanted to lay out the basic possibilities. Postmodernism is equal to multiculturalism because each are examples of a move toward pluralism. Postmodernism is better than multiculturalism because it deconstructs the possibly oppressively normative cultures of which multiculturalism is made up. Or postmodernism is inferior to multiculturalism because by calling everything into question, it leaves no room to say why we should even champion multiculturalism, why oppression is bad. My illustration on this slide on the left side, and here I'll end, is the poem by Dudley Randall I asked you to read called A Different Image. And I think I put this poem here to exemplify the possibilities that postmodernism and multiculturalism could work together. Because I think we're going to see examples as we go on in the semester of the postmodernism is better than multiculturalism option and the postmodernism is worse than multiculturalism option. I wanted to give you a clear example of a poem in which these are shown to work together. So the poem is called A Different Image. It's very short. I'll read it to you. The age requires this task. Create a different image. Reanimate the mask. Shatter the icons of slavery and fear. Replace the leer of the minstrel's burnt cork face with a proud, serene, and classic bronze of Benin. So the context for this poem, Dudley Randall is an African-American poet, and he is saying that what African Americans need to do to escape their oppression is to replace the degrading images of African Americans that circulate in culture, which are images of slavery and images of the mocking racist minstrel show. Replace those with a different image and make that circulate in culture. And he proposes the sculptures of Benin, which is an African civilization. They're bronze sculptures, because that's a beautiful and proud and noble image. So replace the degrading image that has accompanied the oppression of African Americans with a noble and proud image. What strikes me about this poem, though, is he does not say the previous images were lies and the new image is the truth. The icons of slavery and fear and the leer of the minstrel's burnt cork face, those are false. The proud, serene, and classic bronze of Benin is true. Nowhere in the poem does he make that claim. Maybe underlying the logic of the poem is that claim, but he doesn't make it. He says, let's replace one set of images that have been bad for us with another image that can be good for us. And I think that's an example of multiculturalism and postmodernism working together. He admits that any given society at any given time is made up of the circulation of images, no one of which can claim to be true. And he says, so given that postmodern reality, the multicultural imperative for African Americans should be to put into circulation positive images and positive representations of themselves rather than negative ones. So positive representations and negative representations, not true representations and false representations. This poem accepts the logic of postmodernism for multiculturalism. What we want to see next is how that works out in other poets, particularly of the 1950s and 60s. So I want to briefly look in the next lecture at poems by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Amiri Baraka, and Adrienne Rich. And that's how I want to begin the next lecture. I want to see how they weigh in on this question and what this all, some of the further implications of these ideas for art and for politics and for race and for gender and for sexuality. And then we'll get to our first novel, The Ghostwriter. So until then, thanks very much for your attention and have a great day.